Good morning, everyone. My name is Benjamin O'Connor, and I'm a director at New London Architecture. I'm delighted to welcome you to this NLA Breakfast Talk on pop-up potential and the future of retail on our high streets. For those of you less familiar with NLA, we are London's leading independent centre for the built environment. We bring together professionals, politicians, and crucially members of the public to learn about, debate, and ultimately have a say on the future shape of London. Over the past year, the pandemic has exacerbated an already growing concern around the capital's high streets. Back in 2018, Centre for London research found that 22,000 commercial units in the capital had been sitting empty for at least 6 months, and half of these for more than 2 years. Whilst many of these were empty retail units, they also included demolition sites, new office buildings that were having trouble finding longer-term occupiers, and nearly empty car parks. Today, we'll explore ideas for the future of retail on London's high streets, learning from the challenges of the past year and looking for opportunities ahead. Before we start, I'd like to remind you that there'll be a chance to ask our speakers some questions at the end of the event, so please post your questions throughout using the Zoom Q&A button. And finally, I'd just like to thank our retail programme champions, New West End Company and Axiom Architects. I'd now like to hand over to our first speaker, Kate Honey, who is the co-founder of Allot. Allot is a new network that pairs organisations in need of space with businesses that have spaces to offer. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you so much, Ben. It's Kate Honey, but don't worry, people do that all the time. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you, and thank you so much for having me today. My name is Kate Honey. I founded Allot last year with my colleague and friend, Freddie Broadhurst. I'm also a consultant at Portland, advising on community engagement and social sustainability. I've also been working with the Quality of Life Foundation throughout the past year. For those of you who don't know, the Quality of Life Foundation aims to improve health and well-being through creating a kind of movement to catalyse change in the built environment sector. And you should read our recent framework, it's very good. I'm also part of Land Aid's pro bono panel, helping to broker support for young people and youth homelessness charities in the industry. So it's been a very busy year, and previously worked at Soundings and the Prince's Regeneration Trust. So a lot of my work's always been about understanding place and people and the intricacies of how people use place, and the importance of making sure that places are relevant to people that live there. So about Allot. Allot is a network that pairs publicly funded charities in need of space with landlords that can offer free of charge and high quality underused space. It's all about building the concept of sharing into the way that the built environment operates, and that is our kind of mission. If you go on to the next slide, sorry, the statement is there. So quickly, just to kind of give a background into why we started Allot in the first place. Freddie and I actually were kind of walking around Moorgate on a Saturday afternoon, and of course we knew that the offices would tend to be shut. It's Saturday, nobody's working, but we were very sad to see that all the kind of cafes and local restaurants were also shut as well. We tried to go to Wagamama for lunch and we couldn't get in. And we just thought it was shocking that in the middle of one of the kind of biggest cities in the world, you have this amazing space that just sits there totally unused, and we just thought there must be some kind of way to do something about that. Also, we started thinking about this before COVID even was a thing, but of course it has massively amplified the kind of turn of the spaces that were previously used and obviously now not used and sitting vacant, and the high street is a really kind of fundamental part of that, an important thing to look into. If you go on to the next slide, please. Everyone must be very bored of hearing the phrase building back better, but it is really important to think about. So our kind of model we want to look at really jumps on the back of this initiative, but it's all about kind of being more socially conscious, generating social capital through the way that we use our spaces, creating kind of important circular economies, of providing better uses and kind of flexibility for office spaces, galleries, retail spaces, workshop spaces, etc. It's about being more resourceful, using what we have, making the most of it, using this kind of existing stock, and the concept of sharing, which I know it doesn't come naturally to a lot of businesses, but it really brings a huge amount of value. And being more responsive to problems and needs of the time by facilitating temporary solutions. So a lot of, we don't want to always look at the short term or kind of longer term plans and regulations. We want to be able to be flexible about how we use these spaces and respond to urgent community needs, which of course we have a lot of at the moment. A lot is also part of the NLA's Build Back Better programme, so thank you again for having us. If you go on to the next slide. So our model essentially creates two databases, a database of people who are landowners, businesses, etc., that are happy to share space, have high quality space that is just kind of sitting vacant or isn't at its maximum capacity. And another database of space occupiers who will always be charities and community groups very local to an area that are in a huge need of space. And again, obviously, that is something that has come totally to the forefront at the moment, the amount of charities that are in desperate need. The reason that our model is different to when this is done previously is that we very much tailor the matches between the space that is available and the person who uses it. So for example, some of the developers that we're working with have a focus at the moment on a particular local social issue, whether that's youth mental health or homelessness, etc. So if they have a space available and we already know that this is a priority for them as a business, we can match them with somebody, a local charity that delivers that service, and it's a win-win for both sides. We also see kind of longer term that it's not just about the space, it's about the skills sharing and opportunities that are created through that partnership. Next slide, please. So we're currently engaging with a whole load of wonderful businesses. Obviously, given COVID and the nature of COVID, there's a huge need for this space, but we're in lockdown, so we haven't been able to actually deliver a lot of the projects yet. We need to wait until these spaces open up again, and then we can start to facilitate this kind of relationship between the space user and the space sharer in actual practice. So businesses, tenants of an existing building, but also the landlord's the owner of the business. It needs to be a partnership between both to make sure it's successful. And the space occupiers, charities and charity networks, local authorities we're working closely with. Renato, who's on this call, is one of our partners. Business improvement districts, who are obviously all focused on increasing footfall and bringing people back to areas after they've been kind of deserted for such a long time, and forums and media. Next slide, please. Sorry. So the benefits of sharing space obviously kind of go without saying, but a lot of charities, and I know this also through the work with Land Aid, but a lot of charities have really struggled to maintain support and funding and donations and levels of volunteering throughout the last year. But even before that, it's important to support charities anyway. But it's kind of obviously been catalyzed. So we want to be able to support these initiatives they're doing by allowing them to use a space and kind of not have to pay for it and feel supported by businesses in the local area, including landlords. We also want to look at compensating for limited available funding. This is something we know that we've spoken to lots of local authorities about, that it's always been difficult to make the case for building high spec community facilities, but particularly now that's even less of an option, and particularly making sure these spaces are kind of COVID safe, etc., costs a huge amount of money. So if a space is already existing that the charity can operate within, it takes a lot of pressure off that. And also activating unused and vacant spaces in areas is only a good thing, again, because we want to bring spaces back to life and we want to support other businesses in the area. So we are working with Social Value Portal to work out ways of measuring this partnership and the wider benefits that using an existing space for multiple uses rather than just one static use can have a wider impact on the local society. Next slide, please. What spaces can be shared? Literally anything. It's really interesting that we started off, obviously in Moorgate, just looking at a foyer of a huge office building, but actually any space can be shared in some way as long as it's got heating and electricity. So at the moment, I mean, we're looking at anything from huge kind of retail ground floor uses to sharing offices with companies that are actually already operating within there. You can use an entirely vacant space for an entire community use, or you could share it with a company that and the charity can just use kind of a desk in half of the office. Obviously, this recent Arab study saying that only 35% of the workforce will be going back to the office by the end of this year means that there will be a huge amount of office space available. And yes, I mean, meeting rooms as well, and the amount of time that charities want these spaces for totally varies as well. So for some local community groups we've spoken to, they might be looking for a space to run a children's club every evening, but some might just want to hold a trustee meeting once a month. So it totally varies and it depends on what's available. Next slide, please. Thank you, Freddie, for this beautiful map, London Borough of Somewhere, very funny. But this really demonstrates, if you think of this as a high street and you think about community uses can be anything, and they can really create this kind of really flexible way of using high street with existing spaces that are already there. So these are all ideas that have already been put forward by various charities that we've been speaking to. But it just shows the level of flexibility that will kind of start to make the place a bit of a destination again. And again, these don't need to be permanent uses. They can literally just be, you know, an evening a week or over the weekend, etc. But they just bring a bit more life back into high street that might be kind of laying vacant or have been laying vacant, particularly over the last year. One particular, the top right hand corner is Skip Gallery, and they have some fantastic ideas. So if anyone's interested, let me know afterwards. Next slide, please. So this is the kind of nitty gritty side of things, and the question we often get asked is who covers the cost of using the space? And the whole model, it's very important that it is free of charge to the charities and community groups. That's how it kind of started. The space is already existing, they shouldn't need to pay for it, because the benefits that come for both sides, not just the charities but the space sharer, are so important, so tangible, that offering it free of charge actually makes sense. The only costs that really need to be covered are the kind of servicing costs and security. But again, because lots of companies invest a huge amount in kind of corporate social responsibility and ESG and local charities anyway, offering something that you already have and just sharing it means that the benefits just are still the same, but cost a lot less to a business. So actually it makes a lot of sense from that angle. And the social impact obviously outweighs the cost. The amount of positive benefit that you bring a local community is so high that it makes sense to, you know, pay for some electricity and some bills when you are receiving that. We're also looking and speaking to various councils about business rates relief and whether that can be can provide a kind of financial incentive for taking part in this initiative. Next slide, please. So we've been working very closely with our wonderful law partners, Trowers and Hamlins, who have helped us develop a space share agreement, which basically means that the arrangement between the space sharer and the space user is not a tenancy, which means that the legalities of it are not nearly as intense. It's a license to occupy instead, which can be anything up to 6 months. It grants non-exclusive access to the space, meaning that the charity or community group operating in space aren't there permanently. And again, it's all about the model of sharing, so that's a very important point. I think it also de-risks for the space sharer because, you know, if it is a kind of retail unit and obviously a business will want to, a landlord will want to rent it out as soon as possible and recuperate costs that have been lost. It's important to know that the whole model is that this is temporary, and part of the space share agreement is that once that permanent tenant comes, the charity will then move out and we will find them a different space because of this database that we have. And yes, because we'll have a kind of network of various spaces available, it's kind of easy to move a charity from one space to another as long as we have a good relationship with various landowners in the area. Next slide, please. I think this is the final one, and again, this is kind of nitty-gritty side, but this just summarizes the process that we carry out, just to make sure that the match is always perfect and that the space share in the space user or occupier have a kind of good, strong, positive relationship. It's important to note as well that the kind of allot model means that we act very much as a facilitator of that relationship between both sides, because obviously, you know, we want to de-risk the process in every way. We don't want there to ever be a kind of PR nightmare from a space sharer giving a space to a charity, then taking it away again. We need to act as that intermediary, because it makes sense. We understand the risks from both sides. So yes, there you go. I think actually that's everything from my lot slide. Yes. But thanks, I'll pass over.
Great, thank you very much, Kate. For those of you that have joined in the last 15 minutes or so, please do feel free to ask questions throughout using the Zoom Q&A button, and I'll try and get to those at the end. Our next speaker is Renata Guerra of Westminster City Council, manager of their Voids Activation and Pop-Up Project Scheme. Renata, over to you.
Thank you, Ben. Hi, so I'm going to talk to you about the West Activation and Pop-Up Project that we are developing. So we are developing this project to rapidly address the impact that vacant premises have in visitors' perception of a place. And what this project will do is to enliven in vacant premises across the West End with a well-curated program of events, activities, and pop-up ventures. Next slide, please. This project is part of a wider economic recovery plan that has 5 work streams, which are pop-up, animation, sustained hospitality, future West End occupiers, and Westminster's investment service. Today, we're going to focus on the pop-up element. And so the current situation has created this amazing opportunity to make this area of London accessible for a new demographic of businesses who otherwise wouldn't have been able to operate in this area due to the high operational costs. And it is also an amazing opportunity to rethink the use of commercial premises and make these spaces available for alternative uses, including cultural activities. Next slide, please. So with this in mind, we want to create an entrepreneurial ecosystem that supports a small scale business, emerging creative talent, by giving them the opportunity to activate some of these vacant premises. And our strategy is to create differentiated approaches that are going to raise the profile of each area by capturing its qualities and its character. And what we want to do is to create a targeted network of activations that are going to create a temporary place, which is going to be structured by all these interactions and social processes that are going to take place within it. For us, it's also very important that we create these destinations that can be experienced through practice spaces, and that will create temporary social locations. Next slide, please. So one of the questions that we recurrently repeat to ourselves is, how can these temporary activations bring people back into the West End? For us, we think that it's key to activate and enhance the pedestrian and streetscape experience, and also to create activations that exist for a limited period of time, which means that they are in constant evolution, and that because of this encourage people to not only stay longer, but also to return to the area to seek new experiences. And we also think that it's very important to provide options for everyone and to diversify the existing offer. The challenge that we have is to build a sense of place as we occupy it. So we're working very closely with the BIDs, in this case with Holba, to try to create a project that will promote the area's cultural assets in an engaging way. So with them, we have created this project called Westminster City Council Celebrates Art in a Form, and it is in partnership with Art of London. So what we're trying to do is, Holba had already this amazing cultural program in place, and what we're trying to do is try to expand this program and incorporate some of the activities indoors, because most of the activities that they have planned are going to take place in the public realm, and they have amazing projects such as the Gallery Without Walls, the Augmented Reality Gallery, and the Piccadilly Art Line. So we're thinking, how can we bring these activities and indoors and connect both the private and the public realms. So our aim is to encourage people to encourage interaction within these unusual spaces, and also to some sort of like allow people to allow for these spaces to be consumed as experiences. And next slide, please. For us, it would be very simple to just commission us artworks that will sit nicely behind the walls or the windows, but we want to take a step further and actually create dynamic spaces that people see always active and where things are going on inside all the time. So some of the concepts that we have developed for this area is to turn these empty premises into artist residences that are going to be these studios, temporary studios in which artists are going to generate live art from. And for us, it's important to engage visitors with also the production process and not necessarily with the objects or the art or the artworks itself. We're also thinking about enlivening these spaces with fringe theater shows and live performances. And in this particular activation, technology is going to play a key role, because we're thinking of how can we connect with people that cannot be there in person because they are either self-isolating or they are far, they're not in London at the moment. So how can we use technology and alternative channels to make these programs accessible? We're also working with cultural institutions to create these detachable galleries, that it's a space that allows institutions to spread their program and occupy void premises. And for example, some of the institutions can create a sneak peek, they can showcase a sneak peek of a collection that they have in the museum. And we want to see how these project interdependencies create new routes, because if a passerby sees this amazing installation, it would be very interesting to see if then he would take a detour and actually visit the museum or the institution. And for us, it's about transforming the perception of the area just by walking around. Next slide, please. The other bit that we are working very closely with in the strategy is NWEC, and they manage the Oxford Street area that, as you know, is very focused in retail. And they see themselves as a first in district for fashion, technology, and innovation. So we're working with them on a strategy to create more adaptable and resilient retail environments. And for us, it's key to create some sort of like an enduring relationship with the visitors, and also to bring local distinctiveness to these global places. And while we're doing that, we are trying to also diversify the existing offer by bringing cultural uses. So we are very aware about the changes in working practices. We don't know if offices are going to be back in the city at their full capacity, which is why it is very important to think beyond transactional retail and business models that rely on convenience, and try to focus on incorporating activities and services that will add value to the shopping experience and that will give visitors a reason to come to the district. So next slide, please. With this in mind, we have designed some activation concepts, such as, for example, creating these fashion ateliers, which are going to explore models that support the circular economy, and concepts such as made to order and upcycling, which is going to be a space where people can bring their old clothes or their stock inventory so they can be reworked into a new piece. And it is all about having using the process of production to provide a highly personalized experience for visitors. We are also creating these spaces that we call dreamscapes, which are spaces that will provide visitors with the spaces that the city or the area are lacking, and that are going to perform as a space that is 50% a gallery, 50% a shop. It's a space where engagement is prioritized over sales. And then when we thought about bringing cultural uses into this area, but how can we bring a cultural offer that is relevant for the area? So we're thinking about working with digital and mixed media artists, so we can create these mixed reality zones, which are responsive environments in which technology enables to construct memorable experiences. And next slide, please. And so finally, the delivery framework and how are we working with businesses and partners to deliver this project. It is only possible under a collaborative approach and by through a strategic partnership between Westminster City Council, property owners, and the BIDs in this case, and WEC and HOLBA. And we have to develop a flexible operational framework, which has challenged our internal processes and the way we work in order to be able to respond quickly and actually support resilience under these extraordinary circumstances. So what has come out of this partnership is we are able to provide to pop-up occupiers with a period of free rent, so they can rent for free in these premises, a rates-free period after the central government's rates holiday period comes to a tapered end in July, a financial support through our Showcasing Arts, Culture and Enterprise Fund, and property management, because we will have a space operator who will enter into direct lease with the property owner and then license the space to a wide variety of occupiers, and he or she will be also responsible to ensure that the proposals comply with all the regulations and that are ready to be delivered. For us, it's been very important for these three key delivery partners to work on an integral approach, and so we can address the area as a whole and not have these isolated activations, but we can, because of this, we've been able to create and develop a strategy that will create places, and it's very interesting for us to use these areas of the city as a testing landscape where we can test new ideas for a better future, and that we hope that will fit the medium and longer term strategies for these areas. And we are also thinking of how important it is to connect technology, places, and people so we can create these better places. And as Kate mentioned before, our aim is to just build back better places. And for us, it's very important to create this healthy entrepreneurial ecosystem that will be attractive for future users. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renata. Again, if you joined recently, please do post your questions in the Zoom Q&A. We are going to move into a panel discussion, which I'm excited that we have plenty of time for, because quite often we run on. But before we do that, I'm going to introduce two new panelists. So we've got Denz Ibrahim, who's Head of Retail and Futuring at L&G, and Emily Berwin, Director at Meanwhile Space. And I'm going to come to Denz first. Denz, as landlords, how are you adopting new approaches to retail while creating places that still work for people to live, work, and play?
Hi guys, thank you so much for inviting me today. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting talks and approaches actually. I think to answer that question, we have to think about where we've come from and where we've started. You know, I'm by no means a property guy or a surveyor, but I've kind of ended up in commercial property, very much a background of design and urban design. But I guess what we're inheriting in this kind of new generation of property people is kind of single function, one-dimensional pieces of retail assets, you know, that are cookie cutter, hermetically sealed. And it's no surprise that, you know, a lot of these environments are struggling because they're not reinventing themselves quick enough. And we're in a position where, you know, the industry's been, I guess, run by the same people in the same suits for too long. And we have to begin to rethink, what does the consumer want, and go back to the consumer at the heart of this. So to answer your question, what are we doing kind of moving forward? You know, we've understood the problem, but actually there's a lot of things a lot of people are doing. I think I can talk from our side of things. So I joined a year and a half ago to Legal & General Investment Management. We own about £4 billion worth of retail real assets across the UK, from shopping centres to retail parks to high streets. And one of the biggest things and the biggest missions that we're trying to create in this kind of Retail 2.0 team is to completely reinvent not only how we do retail, but also the philosophy of retail. How do we begin to rethink how the property piece within retail property piece within our business changes its cultural stance on how retail is operated? And we talk about this, I mean, our mission statement is making incredible places for people, but the ultimate kind of the simplistic way of putting it is that historically the landlord was what we call the librarian, you know, collecting renting shops, making sure the shopping centre retail parks were clean. I think that's a given, we have to do that, but actually we're shifting much more from a librarian to an editor and becoming much more involved in the minutiae, you know, and becoming much more editorial in how we curate these environments, making sure we've got the right content at the right time in the right places. And I think that's addressing one big problem. You know, we haven't listened to the customer, we've put the same retailers in the same areas, in the same towns, and therefore it's not relevant and it's not curated enough for the customer to stay engaged. So you're in this position where we're having to take much more control of those environments. The type of kind of innovative things that we're doing to do that, we've got a massive kind of focus and drive on local SME occupiers within our assets. COVID has just been a catalyst to that. I mean, I joined about 6 months before COVID, and that was a big push for us. So we want to drive a very localized SME focus. We also want to begin to combine the mixes of our assets. So I think we're living in cloud cuckoo if we think these at retail assets, I'm talking shopping centres and retail parks, in the next 5 years are going to be 100% retail. I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of them around the 50-60% mark of retail, of which the remaining will be lots of different things that are activated, whether it's co-working, whether it's SME, local, whether it's healthcare, education, leisure, whatever it could be. So we're really focusing on kind of SMEs, we're really focusing on public realm. How do we make the public realm the new anchor, driving amazing engagement, and essentially taking these retail assets into much more places for people just to be in, you know, and they're in the heart of the centres. We don't have a lot of stuff in London, but we have a lot of stuff in incredible towns across the UK where we can drive amazing engagement and have people just come there because they want to, and then they happen to buy something after. And then the last thing is we recently launched a thing called the flexible partnership model, which was all about how do we begin to introduce turnover rents, which reduces risk for the occupiers, but obviously if they're doing well, we're doing well as well, but allows a new type of brand, a new type of entrant to come into our assets that historically couldn't have afforded it. So having kind of revenue models and commercial models which is able to adapt for the right occupiers at the right time. There are a few, I could go on all day, but there are a few of a list of stuff that we're doing at the moment.
Thank you very much, Dens. So Emily, from your recent experience, how can Meanwhile spaces help town centres and neighbourhoods flourish after the pandemic?
Thanks, and thanks for having us here. So we have been, Meanwhile Spaces has been going since 2008, 2009. So really kind of started since the last recession, looking at kind of why high streets weren't working and how we could take advantage of those opportunities. And likewise, I'm not from a property background, I've got creative urban design background, and I think that brings a certain kind of different view of not accepting the norm and how we can kind of really challenge that. And really, a lot of these high streets, as we've already said, weren't working before. They really weren't places that people wanted to go. They were already failing. And on top of that, you're returning to much higher vacancy. So what can we do with this? This is really a kind of great opportunity. And it's also places that people are used to coming. They got good transport links. How do people, they were used to coming to those places before. Our kind of Meanwhile use is not the kind of flight of foot that Kate talks about, although I certainly think that has its place. But ours is kind of more about longer term impact, is about individuals and how we support them to engage with their high street, how they can bring forward their skills and their passions, to really kind of test different uses, to develop them, to grow them, maybe to fail, and that's absolutely okay, because you can't get good at anything without kind of falling down a couple of times. But also kind of to think about that permitted development right, that allows change of commercial use to residential, that there's no going back from, and how we kind of test what might work in those spaces that's different from retail before we go to that point. And because really that is a one-way street, and also to think about the diversity on the high street, and not only of use but of user, and how we create the more accessibility of commercial spaces for people that may come from more disadvantaged backgrounds but still have excellent ideas that bring vibrancy and distinctiveness to those places. and really kind of make them work from that perspective, and give a uniqueness, and thinking about how these can be places that people want to work. Like, people don't want to work in isolation. A lot of people are enjoying working at home, a lot of people aren't, and actually, how do we create local neighborhoods? Most of our work is this kind of outer London neighborhoods that people can kind of come together, be inspired by other people, have that kind of buzz of activity, and that inspiration that ultimately creates their own jobs and supports themselves through what is inevitably the recession that's coming our way. How do we support that kind of growth out of that by enabling and capacity building those individuals? We have mentioned business rates. High business rates are the key barrier still, especially in kind of West End. Like, what happens when that rates holiday finishes? Like, how do we maintain this energy that Renata's talking about bringing, and kind of how do we support that going on a longer term basis for kind of 6 months, year, 2 years, 3 years, so that this becomes the kind of high street of the norm, where they're not taking money in the same way that kind of traditional retail and business rates is kind of geared up for.
It's interesting, you've kind of gone into the next question, I think, which is really helpful. It links in very well around sort of policy changes. Over the last year, we've seen a lot of policies coming in, alfresco dining now extended till September. So I wanted to ask, what kind of planning policies or policies you think local authorities and the government could put in place to support this kind of activity? And maybe it might be good to come to Renata first. Obviously, you've got some policies worked up. What other further initiatives do you think that the government can support on to help this work?
Well, with one of the things we could help is certainly business rates. As you know, following the budget announcement made on the 3rd of March, the government had decided to extend the business rate holiday period until the 30th of June. However, then it comes to a tapper then, which businesses being liable for 33% of rates, which, even if these are welcome news, it is still a very, very high cost that will be very difficult to cover for emerging companies. And then with planning as well, I think we have already made our use classes more flexible by incorporating all the class A1 into one big class, which is class E. And this gives more flexibility to, for example, change the use of a premise or incorporate new business models and for example, include eating and shopping at the same time. So we are working on those policies to make to create more flexible spaces and that can adapt quickly.
Brilliant, thank you. Anyone else have any thoughts on the planning piece? Emily?
So the EU's class, I think, is really useful, and certainly we struggle to do any projects that are shorter than, kind of really short-term uses, maybe a year. Most of our projects are more like 3 to 5 years because of the effort required to go through the planning process. So I think certainly welcome the sort of higher flexibility, but also thinking about those co-location of uses and how they can kind of really come together is still a challenge. So you might have in many of our spaces, you've got kind of people working at desks next to a cafe bakery, next to a jeweler, next to a music producer, and actually how you kind of chop and change through those different uses is still a challenge. And why can't alfresco dining become a kind of permanent thing? It's not. Why is that a temporary thing? It should be something that we welcome. We've been talking about cafe culture in this country for decades. Why are we not embracing that as a sort of longer term opportunity, and kind of welcoming the challenges that recovering from COVID brings? So I think they're kind of key questions from our side.
Ben, can I also add one from our perspective? So we actually thought for a very long time about this when we were developing our concept, because we all come from kind of planning backgrounds and wanted to see a way that we could get around that red tape, which is why our model with the kind of short term, like Emily was just mentioning, is slightly different, because the arrangement that we have with the space sharer and that license to occupy essentially makes the space user almost a visitor of the space, which means that there isn't a kind of long-term planning requirement. It just means that it's temporary. And I think while I know that it's very kind of short-term thinking, as a wider concept, it's actually not. If you can always have spaces that there's a kind of constant option for kind of charities and community groups to use that and kind of rotate while you develop longer term uses, like Emily's with Meanwhile, with kind of community champions and creating this almost guardianship of the high street. I think it's really good, and I think it almost acts as a kind of test bed. So yeah, I mean, I definitely think that long term planning's change around it, but until that point, it will just take too long, and we need to react quickly.
Great, thank you, Kat. I'm going to stay with you because there's a couple of questions specifically for you and a question I had, which I'm going to try and merge together. So one of them is how you initially were engaging developers and landlords and getting them to understand the value. And there is this sort of, we're in this very weird time at the moment where, you know, often landlords are hoping that they're going to get high-end luxury retail come in and pay the rent and all that. So there's this sort of uncertainty about who's coming back, what the appetite is going to be. So I guess it's sort of a two-parter on how did you initially engage, and are you finding it's difficult now because of this uncertainty to get that commitment from those the space owners?
It's actually quite a short and sweet answer to this one, because for the initial engagement, we have a background in this world anyway. So we've worked so closely with developers, and a lot of it is a kind of actually from a comms perspective, like how can we start to build trust in developers again, which was at an all-time low, and kind of demonstrate a active interest in developers caring for the communities that they operate in. They wanted to know how to do that, and at the same time we're engaging a lot with communities who are just saying, you know, there's nothing for us here, we're not being supported, etc., etc. So we already had that knowledge as a kind of base case. So it was actually relatively easy to put that forward and to kind of demonstrate it in practice. This is happening, you need to do something about it. And then I think to the second point, building on that, while obviously, you know, it's been a huge financial struggle for a huge amount of landlords, at the same time, and again, back to this kind of very boring Build Back Better phrase, but it is so important, is that ESG is just such a priority for people at the moment. It's so important that once we come out of this huge struggle, we do things slightly differently. And because the model doesn't require a huge amount of investment from the space share of the landlord at all, it's literally just give this space to a local community group, help them regrow until you find a permanent tenant. There's actually not that much of a risk behind it. So yeah, I think that answers your question, hopefully.
Yes, I think that's a great answer, thank you. I've got a question here that's posited to Emily, but of course if anyone else wants to chip in, please do. Emily, coming from an urban design background, how do you think that greening spaces will play into these discussions? And do you think that re-enabling high street spaces can have a role in this?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we think of ourselves as kind of urban design in practice rather than the sort of theoretical approach. So it's like on the ground activity and a kind of iterative process to understand what each neighbourhood or high street really needs, and how we might be able to bring activity and uses that complement what's there already. And that's done through really intensive engagement with local people, whether they'll be using those spaces as tenants or as visitors. And growing is, you know, the kind of sustainability agenda is at the forefront of people's minds. And so growing food and the kind of circular economy is really important and comes up time and time again. And where there is space for food growing, one of our projects in Loughborough Junction is kind of built on the concept that there was already a kind of farm there. There was already a community farm there. How do we bring employment to that land, because it's employment originally, and how do we fit the kind of food growing around and above and about the kind of building that's being built on that space for local people. So greening spaces and particularly food growing is kind of central to what we do, and kind of spilling out into, you know, parks where we might be in a park, and kind of how we bring activity that sort of starts to blur the lines of the thresholds between those green spaces and the kind of buildings and the activities that happen there. You know, not being too kind of siloed and in a box is absolutely important. But primarily we work in kind of problem buildings or problem high streets or neighborhoods where there's a kind of a longer term need for looking holistically at what and how we can create a better place. And the principles of urban design are really core to that.
Great, thank you, Emily. Did anyone else want to mention that? Dens, you spoke a bit about public ground. Anything else you want to add? Oh, you're on mute, Dens.
Sorry, guys. Classic. I mean, as similarly, I come from an urban design background, kind of started in as a landscape architect, and then very quickly went into urban design and master planning. I guess I moved very quickly out of the physical designing and much more into the kind of in-depth consumer research piece and understanding how people kind of behave and live, work and play. And I guess one of the reason I kind of went into this was my biggest frustrations kind of went into tech startup, then went into a big kind of real estate agency, set up a placemaking business, and then moved over essentially client side to LNG. And there was a continuous and a consistent frustration for me because in my creative world, you know, there was always a discussion around materiality, space. In my agency world or property world, it's all about rent, occupier, and yields. And no one was really talking about people and customers. And I felt like there was a real opportunity to marry that through the notion of placemaking, the notion of urban design through placemaking. And I think that's always the hidden answer is if you begin to understand what the customer wants and how they want to engage and frequent these public realms, these spaces, they become the anchors. You know, actually the anchors of tomorrow, I don't believe, are your big department stores and your big anchor stores. They are incredible pieces of public realm that happen to be the glue of everything else that sits around it. So the first thing that we're doing in our shopping centers is completely not forgetting about the first thing we did was forgetting about the stores, but thinking about all the bits that connect the stores. So how do you make those journeys, those places absolutely amazing? You know, and we're turning essentially all of our shopping centers into indoor play parks. So they're places where you can come in, you can play, you can plug your laptop in, you can sit, you can chill, you can eat something, but they happen to be surrounded by shops. So there is a real, and that comes from my urban design background, there is a real, I guess, respect and understanding of how important those places are.
Great, thank you, Dens. I'm going to move on to another question here. And actually, Kate, you spoke a little bit about space sharing and office sharing. There's a question here, which is, what do you think about the concept of shop shares, which could help existing tenants achieve additional income streams, e.g. a daytime shop might let out the premises for an evening activity, giving them a greater chance of surviving. Maybe, Kate, you might have a comment on that one.
Yeah, sorry, I was unmuting just in anticipation that you were going to ask me. So I think that's a fantastic idea. And as I kind of mentioned in my presentation, any space can be shared as long as that somebody is willing to use it and somebody is willing to share it. And we've definitely found that shops can easily be shared, and it's important that they are, because shops, I think, and kind of back to Den's point, that shouldn't actually just be about buying things, they should be about having an experience in a space. But I mean, yeah, I definitely think that is a fantastic concept, and the important thing in making it work is making sure that you can really, really kind of bespokely curate what happens within there. You need to make sure that it provides a solution to a need from the local area. You need to do the research first. What do people actually want this to be, and how can we kind of combine these various community uses together in this space or in this shop, because then it will have kind of longer term success. And that's why tailored matching, I think, works so well.
I think, sorry, could I just add on to that? I think from a kind of landlord's perspective, and Kate's point is totally right, but like looking at the reality of it, if you think about the landlords, they just at the moment they haven't got the capacity to be that curator, to operate it, to be able to manage that. I mean, we're setting up all new teams to begin to be able to do that, but actually the traditional landlord model isn't set up for that, you know, and it isn't going to be the occupier's responsibility to do that because they just wouldn't want to do it. So the way to do it is either you bring people in to be your curators, or you do it in-house. And I talk to my guys a lot about this, you know, historically the commodity of those shopping centres and retail parks was space, but actually we're moving it more towards time. How do you begin to think about time as the commodity? And we're launching a kind of an incredible immense program for every single shopping centre, which hosts 1,000 events, which is yoga classes, boxercise, book clubs, chess clubs. But actually you could be that occupier that wants to rent that for an hour a week or an hour a day, but then your growth could be starting from that hour to actually having half a day to then having a shop or a market stall. And that's your growth, as opposed to the growth being, you know what, I'll launch a pop-up, which is perfectly okay as well, and then I'll launch a permanent. And I think the point here is about rhythm, and shop shares requires a lot more operational skill. A lot of landlords aren't ready for that yet. We're trying to build the teams that are ready for that, and it creates a whole new ecosystem of occupier that will eventually, if they do well, come in to become actually shop owners, I think.
Great, thank
Absolutely.
you. I want to move on because we've got a lot of really interesting questions here and we've got 8 minutes left. So I'm going to, there's sort of 2 questions here that are looking, have sort of suggested some international examples. It's one of the things I wanted to look at, and I'm going to come to Renata on this. So we've got 2 points here. One is Claire Richards has put in, is Renata aware of this successful NYC initiative providing a range of musical performances and shopfront windows? And then we have another one here. Has Westminster Council looked at the business model for the outside artsy and performance shopping malls in Hong Kong? Extremely high commercial rent prices make money while still providing support for emerging creative businesses in the independent sector. So how much does sort of international and other examples factor into the work that you're doing, Renata? And if I can come to the rest of you, if you've got any examples that you think are particularly good that you want to highlight.
Yes, so for, well, in our case, so we have 2 work streams. One is pop-up activation, which is all the activations that take place indoors, and then is the animation, which is all the program that is going to take place outdoors in the public realm. And then we have a future occupiers element that is not led by Westminster City Council, but by London and Partners, which focuses on approaching international brands and attracting international brands to these areas. So we all work together, but we work separately, but we are always communicating and interlinking the projects we have. So for example, in responding to Claire's comment about what's happening in New York, I've seen the example, and the only reason why we're doing in this case is where we're focusing on performances is because in the Holba area, the theater industry is a key sector for them, and it has been highly impacted due to the pandemic. So a lot of the artists, the music creators, the costume designers have been left without a place where to perform or where to rehearse, which is why we are creating this targeted strategy to address that specific sector in the area, which is theater. And then about the international models, we've tried to look at some case studies of what's going on in other cities, but because this is something that has had no precedent before, especially with COVID, it is developing. Most of the models that are taking place to respond to this pandemic are developing at the time we speak. So we are working, we of course try to take as examples of what happens in our surroundings, but again, we're trying to focus on how can we address the local problems and the local needs that each specific area has.
Great, thank you, Renata. And to the rest of the panel, are there any sort of examples of international and national projects that really stick out to you that you think were particularly successful? Maybe Emily?
When we were setting up, we looked a lot at this, kind of working on the idea that what we're doing is not new. And actually, it's not new, but it's like, how do we become that kind of nucleus for the information? We worked a lot with Renew Newcastle in Australia, who were doing some really interesting stuff back then, and were kind of pioneering whole sort of downtown area and getting artists into those spaces. So we kind of shared templates and toolkits from them. They kind of talked us through their model, and we pretty much took on a very similar model. And then over the years, we've done a lot with projects in Germany. One of my core senior members of staff is worked on projects in Berlin, and kind of bringing that learning and that understanding to the projects here. And we're part of a kind of EU group called STUN, where they kind of come together, it's kind of led by the guys doing the Grand Voisin in Paris. And so it's kind of sharing, peer-to-peer sharing, working on projects, working ways around problems, because really what we haven't talked about, which I quite like to talk about, is the kind of resource and skill required to do these kind of projects is hugely intensive. And actually it requires so much knowledge and so much energy over such a long period of time to make these projects work. And actually it is about building that capacity and that understanding and sharing ways around the barriers and the kind of difficulties that people have encountered.
Thanks, Emily. I wish we had like another hour, because we've got some questions here that could be a whole event in themselves. So I'm going to try and get to one more because we've got a few minutes left. I had a very interesting discussion. Do you panelists think high street landlords are ready to adjust their rental income expectations to accommodate various uses mentioned by speakers? Maybe I'll come to Dens on that one first, and then I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that.
I think it's going to happen organically. I think it's going to happen anyway, because they have to. I mean, zone one, London is very different to a lot of other neighborhoods. So I think other neighborhoods outside of London may happen quicker. You might begin to see a correction of the rents much quicker. But actually what you might see is that I think the rents is at one point of it, but there's also too much retail. So you're also going to see a different type of occupier base, which may pay those rents, right? And that might be slightly different, and it might be a different business model. So there's a chunk of the retail space that will be taken by people that are paying existing rents that are slightly different business model, which probably aren't retail. Then you'll be having a piece of it which will be corrected, kind of refocusing that. I don't know if that's, I mean, some resilient areas in London probably what that won't happen. And then you'll have a bunch of retail space that I think will be completely remodeled to much more focus on SMEs and locals, and that will be kind of like a turnover based piece. And if you have a big enough critical mass, actually inadvertently the landlord will make more money because they'll be driving more turnover. So I think it's not an easy question saying, are they going to be rebased? I think it's going to be kind of fitting in 3 or 4 different brackets.
Great, thanks, Dens. I'm going to try and squeeze one more in, which it's a biggie, but hopefully we can get through it in 2 minutes. So we've spoken touched a little bit on this, but there's certainly across our membership a real desire that we sort of jump on this energy around the COVID recovery to support the net zero agenda and our ambitions on that. So this question here is, how much does environmental sustainability feature in flexible pop-up type plans for the high street and similar areas? Is there a risk that there'll be a huge amount of temporary use materials that will be discarded after only a few months or years, e.g. temporary artworks, parklets, etc.? Who wants to kick that off? I feel like Kate and Emily probably are good to start on that. Emily.
It's really core to the way we think about things, absolutely. And I think the way to sort of mitigate that sort of huge potential waste, is to sort of build a network of people who are kind of ready to take that on. So just last week, we gave back one of our arches. We've got a relationship with Archco, strategic relationship. We've got 15 arches in a neighbourhood, and they wanted us to remove a lot of the work that we'd done to that arch to make it usable. Now we'd hired a van, but actually 95% went to the local neighbours because we knew them. Someone was building an art studio, someone was doing, fitting out the rest of their space. Hardly any of that came back with us, and what did we took it back to our office. So I think it's about building those relationships. It's about understanding what people might need. But even to build that in the first place, we'd worked in partnership with an organisation called the Remakery, which was a local kind of recycling centre. So it's using those products, it's recycling what you've got, using good products as well to make sure that they don't just go, it's nothing against IKEA, but it's not just a kind of IKEA run that falls apart when you're done. It's like, it's kind of thinking a bit more like that, but it's also thinking what else you can layer in. So we've got anaerobic digesters, we've got photovoltaics that we're looking at, kind of what innovation can you bring to these kind of projects that you can test out and move around. We've always thought about portability.
Great, thank you. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Kate?
Just very, very quickly, our models again are different, might never lose, but we just use what is already there, what is already existing. All we need is internet, lighting, and water. People can bring some tables and chairs if they want, but that's from our angle, it's very sustainable because you're literally just doubling or tripling or quadrupling the use of something that already exists.
Great, thanks, Kate. Well, we're out of time. Sorry if we didn't get to your question. We did have a bunch of very interesting questions there, but do join us for the next event of the retail programme. I'm sure we'll be able to pick some of these up. So a huge thank you to all of our panellists today and for those great presentations. Thank you for coming. Thank you to our audience at home. And just a final thank you to our programme champions, New West End Company and Axiom Architects. And hopefully we'll see you at an event very soon. Thank you all.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.